And a very beautiful community. It's after 11 here in London, and I'm sorry to be coming through so late. I know a lot of you will watch the next day. For health reasons, I couldn't get to the chair earlier. Putin is talking to Trump tomorrow. Trump is talking to Putin tomorrow. So, unfortunately, that's important, not just because the disordered nature of the world means that lots of things are unpredictable, but because the power of the personality is particularly important at this moment in time. Much of what happens, not just in the United States, but in the world, depends on what kind of mood Trump wakes up in. And certainly as far as security in Europe and Ukraine security goes, much depends on what kind of mood Mr. Putin wakes up in. Mr. Putin is undecided, in my view, still, about what to do. Mark Galeotti was talking today about how Putin dithers when big decisions come along. And I think that's right. Putin can have a degree of strategic clarity, but about what to do to get there and how and when, Putin can actually be indecisive. And when he's indecisive, he can float almost in a way that is an evasion of the reality, a bit like a baby playing hide and seek by going like this. So Putin is prone to that, and when he does that, he hopes that maybe something will change in the world that'll make the choice easier for him. So, of course, there are many myths about Putin, and Putin is a leader of very, very considerable competence, but you shouldn't underestimate not just how pathological he is, but that he can be, in some respects, pathetic. Right? He is not a perfectly in control, strong man, psychologically speaking. And you saw that to a degree when the Prigozhin mutiny happened, right? This was a baby, roughly, getting on camera a few hours later and saying, someone do something. So that's important to understand too, because there's this risk that not only Trump, but that you too will idealize Putin. Because one of the things that thinking of people as evil does is a kind of aesthetic glorification of them. So we've got to be careful then, realize that he's hyper competent. Yeah? He's a more competent politician than most Western world leaders at the level of how rigorously he thinks about what he does, how far he looks ahead. But at the same time, he also has plenty of weaknesses, and right now he's floating. What he's floating about is that he knows he wants Ukraine's ungovernability and a degree of political control over it. He also knows that he wants the dissolution of the West as far as its collective capacity to exert negative pressure on Russia goes. But he doesn't know which outcome gets him there. Could a ceasefire in fact be good? Because it will appease Trump and allow Putin more possibility when it comes to a renormalization of relations between Russia and the United States, independently of the Ukraine issue. That was one of the things we said straight away about the first US-Russian meeting a while ago in Saudi, where we were saying that what was distinctive about it was how far they were thinking of the relationship beyond Ukraine. What about stopping the war? Will stopping the war make Ukraine politically toxic and more liable to come under Russian influence? Or will stopping the war give Ukraine opportunities that it won't have if the war carries on, to become more resilient against Russian pressure, where to go, how to balance this. Putin isn't sure. He isn't sure how to weigh that balance, what it needs to look like to him to make a choice one way or the other, and therefore he is floating for now. But what he is fairly disciplined around is how to communicate with Trump. He's quite disciplined around weighing his communication properly with Trump, indulging Trump, but also being able to stand up and insist on whatever it is he thinks are his potential non-negotiables. Now, before we say more about Trump and Putin, let's say a little bit of a pessimistic word about the European coalition of the willing. Now, the way to think about how well or badly the Europeans are doing needs to be clarified, because the public discourse is confused at the moment. There's a lot of praise for positive European action, but it's not clear what it's positive relative to. If Ricky is stuck in a swamp and Ricky is doing a really good job relative to his circumstance of getting out of the swamp, that's kind of good as far as our evaluation of Ricky's enterprise goes, but it's kind of not good if that's nowhere near enough to get out of the swamp. So one question is, how well are European leaders doing relative to the circumstances and complexities and delimitations they face? And you might say, relative to that, they're understandably doing quite well. Could give them a 7 out of 10, let's say. I'm not giving them a 7 out of 10, but you could. Or you could say, well, they might be doing well, but relative to actually meeting Europe's security needs, they're not doing well. And that doesn't mean that they're individually all doing badly. It means that they might be doing well, relative to what delimitations they have to operate under. But doing well relative to these delimitations might be nowhere near good enough relative to what it takes to take care in the current environment of Europe's security in the short and medium term. Now, there's a very considerable commotion around the coalition of the willing that potentially might terminate in putting some troops in some way on the ground in Ukraine. That activity I see more, and I'm sorry to say this, as a sign of European decline and incapacity than as a sign of political health. Now, before we say a bit more about this, partly what's going on is theatre, because the Europeans are exploring what they might do in a way that's actually dependent on what the Russians and the Americans will decide. And the Russians are going to be against this idea of troops in Ukraine, and the United States are going to be against the idea of providing a meaningful backstop for these troops. So let's talk about these two ways of this being realized. Now, one is with a U.S. backstop. Now, one thought is that the United States provides certain minimal things, intelligence, communications, but it doesn't provide a backstop in the sense that it won't get involved if something happens to these European troops. What the Europeans are asking for at the moment is a substantial backstop from the United States. And here we have a problem, because the United States is refusing to isn't interested in giving security guarantees to Ukraine directly. Why would it give security guarantees to Europeans in Ukraine? If it's not going to do the first thing and say, here's a security guarantee for Ukraine, it's not going to do the second thing and say, here's a security guarantee for some kind of European contingent in Ukraine if it gets into trouble. So what about doing this without a meaningful US backstop? Well, there are all the military issues with it, issues of military capacity and manpower, but I'm not qualified to talk about them. So here is what I am qualified to talk about. First of all, there's a very big quality to this activity of something like the following kind. We're going to do this not because it's what we should do, but we're going to do this because we can't do what we should do, so we're just going to do what we can. So there's a real quality to this of a kind of a compensatory activity that is not that meaningful in a predicament of incapacity in which meaningful activities are not possible. Secondly, there's a real democratic issue here. Now, the democratic issue is to do with conflict with Russia and with nuclear confrontation. You can't put troops in Ukraine without reckoning with the nuclear issue, which is roughly, what are you going to do if the Russians fire on your troops? And how clear are you going to be ahead of time what it is exactly that you're going to do? Because as soon as the Russians fire on your troops, if your troops ever get there, and the politics is not looking conducive to that, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to have democratic trouble at home. You're going to have some people saying, well, we've got to respond. And you're going to have other people, the majority, saying, what the hell are our troops doing there, risking direct confrontation with Russia over a country that we care about, but we don't care about existentially, Ukraine. And moreover, if I am an evil advisor of Putin's and there are European troops in Ukraine without an American backstop, the most brilliant thing to do would be to strike at them, because that would generate no response from the Europeans in all likelihood, and further democratic disintegration at home. It'll create polarization and disorder domestically when this happens. So it's a perfect opportunity for Putin to accelerate the decline of Western democracy. So how do you do this without that happening? How do you put troops in Ukraine? Well, the way you do it is by having a democratic conversation with your citizenry. And what you do is you say, here is what we're going to do. Here is why it's important for European security. Here is what our rules of engagement there are going to be. And, here is a little contract, right, with you, our citizenry, about this, right? We're doing this. Here are the benefits and here are the risks. We're your government. We're letting you know why this is important and why we're signing up for this. And that includes a conversation about what will happen if you come under Russian fire, whether you're going to respond, why you're going to respond, how you're going to respond, what the nuclear risk element of that is. And look at what's happening in reality. European leaders are not just not having that conversation with their citizenry. They have no intention of ever having it with their citizenry. That's not a conversation that's going on. So there is very much a kind of galvanization of energy and activity around a scenario that the very people engaged in supposedly trying to bring it closer are hoping doesn't take place. So cumulatively, I'm afraid, the politics as of mid-March 2025, the politics of the coalition of the willing is the politics of European decline. Now, there is a difference between Keir Starmer, who is saying we'll do this with a US backstop, and Macron, who is not, who is speaking about this independently of a US backstop. But there is an element of bluff there. Now let's move to Trump. And by the way, look at this interesting connection again we've just made between democratic capacity, right, and putting troops in Ukraine. You've got to have the democratic capacity to do this, right? And the European leaders feel that they don't, and that's why they're not taking it back to their populations, right? Because they're really engaged in trying to explore a possibility that they actually hope doesn't arise. So let's talk about Trump. Trump said something very ideologically interesting recently on the plane. He said, it's going to be me and the Russians negotiating about dividing up the assets. Now, dividing up the assets, whose assets? Well, the Ukrainian assets, because Russia invaded Ukraine. That's a very interesting ideological expression of what I call hyper-neoliberalism, which I describe as a kind of situation where neoliberalism, a sort of primacy on the market, emphasis of a kind of a magical primacy put on the market, converts into normalization of a kind of conflict of all against all. So in practice, this means I can buy anything I want, and what I can't buy, I can threaten with force into my possession or gain via the exercise of force. So that language of we'll be dividing up the assets is a very nice demonstration of this ideological hyper-neoliberal element that I'm talking about. Trump wants greater renormalization with Russia. And Trump, unlike Biden, has no bottom line with Ukraine. Biden's bottom line was Ukraine has got to survive as a sovereign, independent state. So the West's position was always Ukraine's survival, not Ukraine's victory. But now even Ukraine's survival, even Ukraine's sovereignty is a good to have, but not a must have for the Trump administration. Now, Trump will never be happy for Ukraine to lose its sovereignty, because that'll be a big L written by his name. It'll be politically deleterious for him. But there are circumstances under which he'd probably swallow that outcome, depending on what else happens in the world and what else he gets in his relationship with Russia. So there is now a kind of only a weak commitment. There is no non-negotiable commitment from the United States to Ukraine's survival. And in the short term, what Trump is trying to do is detach the ceasefire idea from a permanent resolution of the war. He tried to get the Ukrainians on board with this. At first failed, then succeeded by bullying them. And now he's going to try, and this is what Witkoff was trying to do in Moscow, to persuade the Russians into this, to detach the idea of the ceasefire from the idea of a more permanent resolution to the war. Putin is doing everything in his power to mix up the two. And one of the difficult balances for Putin right now is how far to keep on enmeshing the two, knowing that actually accepting a ceasefire would be a very compelling concession he could make to Trump that would take the Kremlin some way toward the renormalization of relations with the United States, an opportunity they don't want to lose out on. Now, Putin is floating, and he's going to probably carry on floating for a while. Now, we've already mentioned that while he floats and is uncertain about the ceasefire option, open to it, but very uncertain about whether to take it, and open to a permanent resolution to the war, but again, very uncertain about whether to take it either. While he floats about that, he is still clear about two things. He wants Ukraine's ungovernability and political control over Ukraine, and he wants to dissolve the West as a collective force able to act concertedly against Russia. But I haven't just repeated that for the sake of boring you with this, because there's now a paradox that Putin faces. And that's that his regime is dependent on foreign escalation and possibly even war for regime security. But if the West dissolves itself as a collective force able to act concertedly against Russia, Putin might not have anybody on the other side of the net to play the kind of tennis match he needs to play to achieve the level of regime security he needs at home. That would be a great historical irony if the Putin regime got catastrophically destabilized as a result of Trump selling out to Putin. But history does provide us with ironic turns from time to time, and that's one that I wouldn't expect to likely materialize, but it's certainly a possibility. The rate at which the West is folding right now is very positive, but not entirely positive for Putin because of his dependence on conflict with the West for stability at home. Now, a quick word on Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to enter a Western security alliance like NATO. Entering it now would be also a drop less meaningful than before because NATO is partly dissolved now as far as Article 5 goes. And Ukraine is not on course to get meaningful security guarantees from the United States. So what's left? What's left, and this is enormously important, is Ukraine's military capacity to defend itself against future Russian invasion. Putin will be pushing for as much demilitarization as he can get. If he can't get much in a deal, he'll try to get some. So that means restrictions on the size of Ukraine's military and restrictions on what kind of support it can get, in particular from Europe. It's very important that Ukraine manages to resist being pushed into concessions around this toward Putin, because that's the central pillar of Ukraine getting itself into a position where it can win the peace. If you're not strong enough to defend yourself against the Russians, you're not giving yourself the opportunity to win the peace. And winning the peace is still rightly to be seen as part of the conflict with Russia. And Ukraine winning the peace would be Ukraine to a degree winning the war against Russia, even though so many things will have been lost and sacrificed, including 20% of Ukraine's territory. So that's absolutely central, because it's only if Ukraine gets it that Ukraine will then have an opportunity, and it's not certain Ukraine will realize it's successful, even if it gets that opportunity, to win the peace. So you can't beat the Russians unless you win the peace. You can't win the peace unless you avoid this pressure for demilitarization or some restriction on the kind of support Ukraine can get militarily from the Europeans. Now, Putin is more competent than Trump at negotiating these things, and Putin's inner circle is more competent than Trump's inner circle. So it's a worry that Putin could outmaneuver Trump in a way that puts Ukraine in a very difficult position where it has to make compromises around some very central pillars for its sustenance and economic and political sustainability. The central pillar being its maintenance of sufficient military capacity. So there are Ukraine is not going to be foolish enough to concede excessive ground here, but there's a risk that Putin could outmaneuver Trump sufficiently for Trump to start majorly pressuring Ukraine to make existential concessions in these waters. So that's the pillar that I would absolutely centrally emphasize. Resisting the Russian enterprise for demilitarization, some degree of demilitarization in Ukraine, and resisting a potentially outmaneuvered Trump administration that ends up with a sort of a very corrupted position on this issue, and then pressures Ukraine. So that's, I think, roughly where we are as Putin and Trump talk, I'm afraid. Lots of love.